So there is a document in Lincoln's writings where he wrote on the back of it himself. He says, "The Emancipation Proclamation as first sketched and shown to the cabinet in July 1862." It's the first draft of Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation that he read to his cabinet on the morning of Tuesday, July 22nd. And it's a mouthful. It's 3 sentences, over 300 words. But this is what close readings were all about. If you can wade through the legalese here, you find out some pretty remarkable things. So I'll try to do this. But like I said, it's not the Gettysburg Address. It's not prose poetry. It is a military order, a legal document, and it's very hard to read easily. But if you read it slowly enough and think about it, you can get through it. The document begins, "In pursuance of the 6th section of the Act of Congress entitled, An Act to Suppress Insurrection and to Punish Treason and Rebellion, to seize and confiscate property of rebels and for other purposes, approved July 17, 1862, and which act and the joint resolution explanatory thereof are herewith published, I, Abraham Lincoln, President of the United States, do hereby proclaim to and warn all persons within the contemplation of said 6th section to cease participating in, aiding, countenancing, or abetting the existing rebellion or any rebellion against the government of the United States, and to return to their proper allegiance to the United States on the pain of the forfeitures and seizures as within and by said 6th section provided." That's one sentence. However, you don't sometimes need to know everything about a document or about the words in the document to be able to appreciate what you need to ask in order to learn what it is regarding. In this case, the opening sentence of the first draft of Emancipation begins by referring to the 6th section of an Act of Congress. What is this Act of Congress? You really can't describe Lincoln's emancipation policy without describing this law, the one adopted on July 17, 1862. We now call it the Second Confiscation Act. Lincoln uses its long legal title here, but that's what he's referring to, the Second Confiscation Act. The 6th section provided for a warning from the president that would enable under the statute, the government of the United States to seize property from Confederates in punishment for their treason. Other sections of this bill would also allow the government to free slaves, making them forever free, according to the 9th section of the Second Confiscation Act. That was the emancipation provision of the Second Confiscation Act, and it is, the way I see it and the way a number of scholars see it, the trigger for Lincoln's emancipation decision. The Act of Congress that was approved on July 17th is what drives him to draft his first emancipation order on July 22nd. And to really appreciate what was driving him and why this is such a critical moment, you have to read carefully into this document. There's a small phrase here where if you know anything or remember anything about American civics, should have struck you as strange. Lincoln says, "This act and the joint resolution explanatory thereof are herewith published." The joint resolution explanatory thereof, what does he mean? When Congress adopts a statute, a bill, and the president signs it into law, there's no joint resolution explanatory thereof in usual proceedings. But in this case, that small phrase is hiding a really dramatic story. The Second Confiscation Act is something that Abraham Lincoln had been planning to veto. He was actually convinced that it was unconstitutional. The Constitution specifies how to prosecute and punish treason. And what the Congress during the Civil War was trying to do was punish treason by statute in a way that would help the rebellion and also free slaves. And Lincoln was concerned that they were violating constitutional provisions. And he was worried about it. He thought the same Supreme Court that had just a few years earlier prohibited the containment of slavery from the territories, the one that had said Dred Scott was a slave, that court, still led by Roger Taney, that court would throw the Second Confiscation out as unconstitutional. And so he wrote a veto message. He was actually drafting the veto message earlier that week in the White House when a friend of his came in to see him and was struck by how Abraham Lincoln seemed overwrought. This friend was a senator from Illinois named Orville Browning. He kept a diary, and he wrote in his diary that the president seemed so overwhelmed that he asked him about his health, and Lincoln replied to him, literally it seemed with tears in his eyes, "Browning, I must die sometime." Browning convinced Lincoln not to issue the veto message and to reach out to the leaders on Capitol Hill one more time, and the president did it. And because they negotiated furiously through the night, this is at the very end of the congressional session, they finally agreed that Lincoln would sign the Second Confiscation Act despite his objections, and the Congress would issue that joint resolution explanatory thereof, addressing what he considered to be some of the reasons why the statute did not conform to constitutional requirements about punishing treason. And they proceeded to pass that bill and the resolution, and Lincoln came to Capitol Hill on Thursday, July 17th, signed the measure into law, but released with the measure his veto message. We nowadays call this a presidential signing statement. And of course, it struck members of Congress as strange. They don't know how to proceed if a president says he's signing a measure into law but thinks parts of it might be unconstitutional. You can't override a presidential signing statement the way you can override a presidential veto. Some of them, the leaders on Capitol Hill, these are all Republicans now who are managing this. Republicans in the House, Republicans in the Senate, and this Republican in the White House. They meet, and Lincoln assures them that he will proceed in a way that addresses their concerns. They leave Washington at the end of the session. On Sunday, July 20th, Lincoln spends all day holed up in the White House library writing orders required by the Second Confiscation Act, including this first draft. And this is the draft that he reads to his cabinet on July 22nd. That first sentence had been required by the act. The second sentence and the third sentence are going to spell out what he's going to do to implement the act in regard to slaves. And this is what he says. "And I hereby make known that it is my purpose upon the next meeting of Congress to recommend the adoption of a practical measure for tendering pecuniary, that means financial, aid to the free choice or rejection of any and all states which may then be recognizing and practically sustaining the authority of the United States, and which may then have voluntarily adopted or thereafter may voluntarily adopt gradual abolitionment of slavery within such state or states." Now this is critical. Congress has just passed the Second Confiscation Act. They're leaving Washington at the end of their regular session. They will be returning in December of 1862. And Lincoln is saying when they come back in December, this is the 37th Congress, he will provide to them a plan for encouraging the gradual abolitionment of slavery in loyal slave states, in states that give up any rebellion against the government. This is a proposal he is promising to make, and he is offering money to those slave states who are willing to adopt it. And then he adds, in a final sentence, a kind of stick. If that first offer was the carrot, gradual abolitionment of slavery with financial compensation to the states who adopt it on their own choosing, the stick would be military emancipation for those who don't, or for those who are still in rebellion against the government. This is the sentence. "And as a fit and necessary military measure for effecting this object, I, as Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy of the United States, do order and declare that on the first day of January, in the year of our Lord 1863, all persons held as slaves within any state or states, wherein the constitutional authority of the United States shall not then be practically recognized, submitted to, and maintained, shall then, thenceforward, and forever be free." Invoking his authority as Commander-in-Chief, and not necessarily congressional statute, Lincoln promises to free slaves in the entire region that's in rebellion, whether or not their masters are loyal or disloyal. You see, if you think about it, confiscation, as it was conceived by Congress in the first Confiscation Act from August of 1861 and in the Second Confiscation Act from July of 1862, that was all about punishing treason, which meant that it had to punish individual Confederates for their treason against the government. Loyal Unionists in Confederate states could not be punished under that statute. Lincoln is saying, as a commander-in-chief, using the laws of war and invoking military necessity, he is going to free all slaves, regardless of the loyalty of their masters. There is no treason issue here. This is about military necessity. And he's going to do it starting on January 1st, after Congress is reassembled. Now, of course, I think some of you know, Lincoln reads this to his cabinet on July 22nd, but they convince him to hold it back, not to make it public, until after there's a victory on the battlefield. That victory comes in September, and Lincoln announces his plans, now revised and expanded, on September 22nd, 1862. And he sets once again January 1st, 1863 as the effective date for emancipation. But if you're really shrewd and you're reading closely, you realize that as early as July of 1862, Lincoln had always set January 1st as the effective date. He's organizing this policy around the acts of Congress, the Second Confiscation Act, and then the return of the meeting of Congress. He's using military necessity to protect it against a court challenge, but he is evoking an emancipation measure as an act of justice. That's the phrase he will use in the final Emancipation Proclamation. This is not about confiscating property. This is about freeing people. In the Second Confiscation Act, they call these slaves captives of war. The confiscation of property is part of confiscation, but the freedom of people held as slaves is something separate. The Republicans on Capitol Hill and the President of the United States never concede that people should be legitimately held as property. They have acknowledged the existence of slavery, but they're trying in this moment of emancipation to avoid treating these people as property. This is the basis of their policy. It's the roots of it, and it will grow and become even more evident by the time Lincoln issues his final proclamation on January 1st, 1863. It's a truly revolutionary moment in the war and in American history. There is actually an eyewitness to Lincoln's drafting of the Emancipation Proclamation. He wasn't alone in the White House Library on Sunday, July 20th, 1862, when he was writing out this first draft. Sitting with him was a 23-year-old named John Hay, who had come from Illinois and had been serving as one of Lincoln's private secretaries during the war. Hay was fetching books and helping Lincoln prepare documents surrounding orders related to the Second Confiscation Act. And while he was waiting for Lincoln to finish, he was writing his own letter, a personal letter, to a young girl in New York he was courting, a girl named Mary J. And Hay wrote to Jay at one point with a paragraph that, in retrospect, seems to be an eyewitness account of the actual drafting of the Emancipation Proclamation. And this letter is in the Gilder-Lehrman collection in New York. Hay wrote, "The President himself has been out of pure devotion to what he considers the best interest of humanity, the bulwark of the institution he abhors, for a year. But he will not conserve slavery much longer." Hay writes, "When he next speaks in relation to this defiant and ungrateful villainy, it will be with no uncertain sound. Even now he speaks more boldly and sternly to slaveholders than to the world." And this 23-year-old notes, "If I have sometimes been impatient of his delay, I am so no longer." And so it's this wonderful snapshot through the eyes of a young man to the audience of a young girl reporting on one of the most momentous acts in American history, the creation of the Emancipation Policy.